So Shanaka, you came to my attention initially as a teenager on The Score. This is a show you hosted for a long time on Yes FM, I believe. And you always had your reviews of the games, and it was something that, there wasn't much in the way of English language local analysis, especially of cricket, but many other sports. You've been involved heavily in the sports culture in the local schools. How do you see that? We can talk about rugby and cricket separately, but just even in those two sports, how do you see the translation of talent from schools to the professionals? I mean, is there something that it's, for example, if we take Mahela and Sangha, Sangha Kara, for instance, wasn't necessarily meant to be a Sri Lankan cricketer when he went through the school system. Mm-hmm. He was not up there, but even as a kid, I remember Mahela Jaivan was in the papers regularly. Everyone knew the Anandanal and Mahela would be, one of the big guys there. So, how do you see that translating now in the school system to the professional system?
Well, if you look at some of the guys that we are talking about right now in the Sri Lankan system, guys like Charita Salanka, Vanidu Hasaranga, these guys all played for the same school team. And they've managed to come through and really shine on the international stage as well. But most Sri Lankan cricketers that succeed despite the system rather than because of the system. You know this well. So it is something that we need to address, because the professionalism at the lower levels really needs to improve. Because I was in Birmingham for the play, and I visited my old friend Narayan Ratwatta, who captained first 11 at St. Thomas's, and we went to watch his 11-year-old son play, and just the atmosphere around that game, the fact that everybody got a chance to bat, everybody got a chance to bowl, it was competitive. They were really making sure that participation was a big thing, but also the quality of cricket didn't drop as a result. So just to watch that was quite intriguing for me, because I don't see that level of investment from people in the cricket club, the parents, the well-wishers, the coaches. You'd have the chief selector of the club coming and watching even the under-11s. They're talking about who they're going to play in the county match the upcoming week. So people are interested in sport. In Sri Lanka, we don't really have a wide interest in sport. I think a lot of people just focus purely on studies. Innumerable number of talented sports people who have just stopped because they've got O-levels. I mean, what does O-levels do for you at the end of the day, right? And you're taking away that 15 and 16-year development period from a sportsman.
To really reach a peak.
Absolutely.
Start peaking.
Absolutely. I mean, you're looking at guys like in golf or tennis. That's when they're really, hitting their straps. So we're taking all that away from them. And, I'm sorry, I'm doing A-levels, so I can't come for cricket practice. I've heard that countless times. So I think there needs to be a culture of sport which is outside of just the international sport. I remember being in Australia last month, and I just happened to play. I play ultimate frisbee, so I searched for a game and went down to the recreational arena. And you've got countless basketball courts, countless tennis courts, countless netball courts, and each one of them is being used. Each one of them. It's about 400 people in this recreational facility outdoors in the winter, and everyone's playing some kind of sport. But here, apart from a few runners here and there, or some hardcore guys that will get together and play a game of touch rugby, or somebody who's playing indoor cricket, you don't really have a culture where these sports are being fed. Mm-hmm. So that for me is the biggest problem, that somebody out of school doesn't really have a place to go unless they really want to pursue the sport. So,
I mean, Naren Rathat is a good example, because I remember he's a fast bowler, is he not? And his year was a victorious year.
Yes, we won in '99.
So he's another guy, when we were young, you would remember this really good bowler. Navid Nawaz, he's in the current, he played a few games as well, and did at least one or two internationals. So those were batsmen that, in Naren Rathat as a bowler, they didn't really come through for some reason. Like, well, what was the reason for this? Because it seemed like, when you think back, even later on, Ian Daniel, for instance, there were players who were scoring runs for fun in the international, in the local Premier League and the school system. How come they don't make that next step? And are there not enough places?
There's not enough teams. I think
that's
is
what
the
it
problem.
is. Yeah.
So if someone is not doing well at international level, you've got to have a tier below, which you can send them back to and say, just go and play a bit of cricket at this level, which is not too far of a drop. You don't want them going from A-levels to kindergarten, to use that analogy. You want them to go from first year A-levels to maybe the first week of A-levels, kind of. That needs to be the shift. So you need to have a really strong A team. You need to have a really strong club culture where good players are playing against each other all the time. And it's just competition for places, Kusum. Now that Dhananjay De Silva has come in and kind of established himself as a batting all-rounder, Charith Asalanka is going to be like, oh, I'm going to be losing my place if I don't, don't buck up. Dhanushka Wijetilleke has come in, and there's people like Niroshan Dikwella who will be thinking, hey, I'm as good as him, why not me? So that's what we really need to create, and unfortunately that's only being created at the international level. We need to be creating that at school level, we need to be creating that at club level, at A-team level, at just below A-team level. So if we are creating that competition for places, I think we can go a long way, but you'll know from the business world as well, from your years as a banker, that Sri Lankans have a natural aversion to competition.
Right.
We don't really like somebody else. If somebody in my industry is starting up a new thing, I will do as much as I can to crush him before he even starts.
Right.
And without saying too much, I can say that that kind of attitude is prevalent even in the sporting field. So
something I also noticed with friends of mine who were really good at school level, I mean really good, and then they go into club cricket, but then even now you have to have a job, you have to have something else. You can't make much money from playing club, even though they get paid per game in the Premier League, I think something small. So then it becomes a thing where you're balancing your cricket with your other things, and then there's a social life that creeps in. A lot of clubs in Sri Lanka, Premier League clubs have a very big social sort of get-togethers and those kinds of things. So then I feel like the level just kind of plateaus a little bit, where instead of coming out of school and going into a squad where you play hard and you develop your skills, most players just have to go into what's now a semi-professional sort of model. So that's kind of what you're saying, is you have to make it more professional.
You have to make it more professional. You have to put more accountability on the players. You remember Upeka Fernando, who passed away a few months ago, and he was a prime example. There was no way he was not going to play for Sri Lanka. But he went to the SSC and just completely lost his way because he was not disciplined enough.
I'd like to also talk about the rugby culture, Shanaka. I think we discussed before, I'm from an international school, so it's something that we really miss out on. Now, I've got my brother's kids, nephews, and nieces there. They're really into the rugby, the local rugby culture. So could you give us a little bit of an idea and compare and contrast the two, the cricket culture and the rugby culture, and how come football, cause we both follow the Premier League, and we might talk about that later, because someone's on top of the league now. But I wondered, how come football has struggled to grow in Sri Lanka, whereas rugby just keeps going from strength to strength in some angles?
Well, I think it's a cultural thing, because we've played rugby from the 1800s, Kusum. I think it was 1897 or something that the Sri Lankan Rugby Football Union was set up. Okay. And if I remember right, it's the oldest union outside of the home nations. So there's a lot of traveling Scotsmen, lots of traveling Englishmen who are up there in the hill country in places like Dharawal and Nuwara and places where the climate was great for them. So it's like a warm summer's day, except not as rainy. And so they thought, well, this is ideal for rugby, and let's just start playing. So it's the colonials that started the game off. Then the schools took it up. So Kingswood was the first to start playing rugby, and then Trinity College followed, and then Zahira College. And they were some of the oldest teams that played schools rugby. And then those masters who were maybe the headmasters, the masters in charge of games, who were still old English gentlemen, were pushing kids to play rugby. And it was one of those things that we always did, playing rugby and cricket. So that is part of our colonial hangover. But football is getting much more popular now that the Premier League is so much more available, that the Spanish League is so much more watchable now, with cable TV being very affordable. So kids are moving, I think, into football a lot more. But again, there's been, I'm sorry to say, but kind of a class divide, where football has been played generally in the inner cities, and you get your Javelins and your Renowns and those teams which are not from the most affluent suburbs of Sri Lanka. So there hasn't been a real crossover. So that's something I think.
So football isn't that popular in the school system?
Not as much as rugby is.
Nowhere near, I would assume.
Nowhere near at the moment. Yeah, but hopefully it will catch up. But that's because rugby had a head start of so many, maybe 150 years. Really.
There's a perception of there being a violent culture to rugby from outside. How do you sort of...
Well, I don't think it's any different, Kusum, to the violence that accompanies any kind of identity politics. Okay. Because when you are extreme about your team, your team may be your rugby team, it may be your cricket team. We saw clips, I think, from the Afghanistan-Pakistan game. So it's not alien to any sport, really. And it might even be, you know, your nationality that, you know, you really get aggressive about protecting. So it's the same thing happens in rugby, and because it's a quote-unquote a violent sport, I mean, people smash into each other all the time, so emotions are going to run high. But what I can say about rugby is that usually it's a flare-up and then it's done, which is not often the case for some other conflicts. But it is a problem that needs to be addressed. I mean, we can't have referees being assaulted, we can't have visiting teams being assaulted, we can't have crowds coming onto the pitch. All of these things have happened recently, and I don't think there's enough decisive action being taken by the authorities, the schools or the club authorities, to say, sorry, you're banned from here on, and you didn't take proper precautions. But that being said, Kusum, I was watching PSG play Arsenal a few years ago in the Arsenal members stand. I'm lucky enough to get a ticket from a friend. And I have never felt so frightened for my life really? Inside there, because the chanting is just so violent. You know, if I was one of those PSG players taking a corner, I would have run back to Paris, because it's just so violent, that culture. And it makes our rugby crowds look kindergarten, to be honest. And it's a sad aspect of sport.